did was make the make the ensuite bathroom a little bigger because it was pretty tight, but we sacrificed some closet space, um, which is my only aggravation about the place is I cannot walk into my closet without knocking stuff off the shelves or off. It's like I go in to get a shirt or a tie or something, and I it's like a bull in a china shop. Stuff just hits the ground every time. Uh,
Yeah,
all right,
you need to stack that up and fill it in where
hang it from the ceiling. Um, so good. So this week, we're looking. I hope it isn't redundant. Um, but this idea of the mediation of meaning has been was in the Origins of Christian Realism essay, and it was in both Belief Today's Issue and the Absence of God in Modern Culture essays. And um, those three essays all include this discussion of the mediation of meaning, kind of by the way, as a way of setting up the problematic they're discussing, right? Rather, whether that's a kind of um, indigenous philosophical realism in the development of Christian doctrine, or whether that's the problem of controls on belief, which we're going to see another version of today. Or it's trying to get down to how it is that the transition from a classical notion of science to a modern notion of science, which we also see today, um, creates an ambiguity or anyway a question about how it is God can be an object of cultural reflection. And this essay zooms in on, spends a little more time with this notion of the mediation of meaning. Um, so I hope, like I said, I hope that's not a redundancy, but I do think it's important to hang out with this idea because clearly Lonergan thinks it's of the essence of the contemporary problem of theological method is getting clear about what the consequences of recognizing the mediating function of meaning in human living and as part of human living in theological scholarship. And so this essay, I kind of want to go through the beats of it first, and then I'll open it up for questions. So he starts with this. I like that he does this because he starts with this initial anticipation or this kind of, if you were a phenomenologist, you might say a kind of natural attitude we might have about meaning, where he says that meaning seems like it must be a secondary affair, right? What counts as reality, um, what's of primary interest is not meaning, but the reality meant in acts of meaning. And he says, that's true as far as it goes, but it can conceal something. And the thing that it can conceal is the way in which this is a thing that Lonergan uh, says at some length in Insight is human beings have my teacher Robert Dorn used to say we're conscious in two ways. Um, and one of those ways is what Lonergan has talked about here as the world of immediacy, this sort of realm of especially of the senses. In Insight, he calls it biological extroversion, and it's a way of uh, interfacing with the world that comes online very quickly. It has deep evolutionary roots. It's built into our it's of the essence of our biological survival. He doesn't cite Piaget here, but he's pretty clearly leaning on Piaget and his characterization of how the coordination of motor operations and sensory operations sort of coalesce and cohere and coordinate to give us a coherent way of navigating our habitat early on in life, right? If you are a parent, you know the big difference between children that you have that are not yet mobile and children that are mobile. That's a real sea change in parenting. And part of children being mobile is that they now have this kind of imaginative schema of their space that they move through. Um, and so this is a this is a kind of, and I don't, and Lonergan doesn't even mean this to be in a pejorative sense, but descriptively, this is a kind of animal intelligence. It's a kind of intelligence that is um, tied tightly to our animality, and uh, it deals with what's immediately present. It deals with what you can put your paw on, as Lonergan used to say. And it comes online early, and we get really good at it, and we're good at it at a long for a long time before any kind of philosophical question ever arises or gets put to us. And what Lonergan uh, one of the difficulties then for the philosophical enterprise, Lonergan thinks, is that we spontaneously deploy the criteria of success in animal knowing in our efforts to make sense of fully human knowing. And so in Insight, Lonergan talks about having a spontaneous notion of the real as already out there now. That what's real, he talked about this when he talked about Tertullian, right? That what's real, if it's real, it's got to have a body. It has to be extended in time and space. Um, and and that's a kind of criterion of reality that emerges from the success of our animal sort of mode of environment engagement, right? The example he uses in Insight is of a kitten. You get a really good high resolution photo of a saucer of milk, and the kitten will come up to it, and because it can't drink from it, it's not a real. That's what makes it not a real saucer of milk, is that the kitten can't engage with it in a kind of vital way. So the criterion of reality is some kind of extroverted, vital bodily engagement. Um, and so that's the world. The world of immediacy is a world that has that kind of a mode of engagement. But pretty quickly, also, we're inducted into the world mediated by meaning, and and it turns out that the criterion of reality in the world mediated by meaning is much more open than the criterion of the habitat of an animal. That there's all kinds of stuff um, that can be affirmed as real in the world mediated by meaning that my dog couldn't uh, have, a kind of practical success with. Right. My dog doesn't have a notion of justice. Right. Um, my dog, uh, my dog doesn't, at least to my knowledge, have opinions about poetry. Um, there's a whole the greater part in which human beings live their lives and undergo the drama of being a person happens in this world that is mediated by meaning. But in this essay, Lonergan underlines a further point, which he gestured at in the earlier ones, but he really makes it much clearer here, which is that and it's not just that the world is mediated to us by meaning, right? So that things from the past can be present to us, things in the future can be made present, things that are absent can be made present, things that are non-material can be present. But in the human world, there's all kinds of stuff that's not just mediated by meaning, but also constituted by meaning. That it's to be highfalutin about it, its ontological status, its ontological ground rests in acts of meaning. Um, so think of, for example, the example Lonergan uses in one of the other essays is a law court. That the whole apparatus of human law is something that is what it is. It has its reality in and through human acts of meaning. And you can go in and you can investigate it with as many thermometers and rulers and calipers as you want. But none of those things will help you understand that the room you're in is a court of law. In order to discern that it's a court of law, you have to have some insight into what this room means to the people who pass through it every day. Um, or you could think of vows, right? That the reality of, for example, monastic vows or marital vows, right? That they constitute the reality of a different mode of relationship through acts of meaning. And so, one of there's a funny way in which Lonergan's philosophy here is you'll sometimes hear people talk about things being socially constructed, and they mean that in an anti-realist way, right? There's real stuff, right? This is a kind of uh, sometimes you'll hear kind of undergraduate students will say this a lot. Well, it's just socially constructed. Um, and so they take a constructivist position about all kinds of social things, right? So there's this recognition that there are big parts of human living that are constituted by meanings, and not just individual meanings, but social meanings. And so it's a kind of half an insight. But Lonergan would want to say, right, yes, it's socially constructed, or yes, it's constructed by meanings, it's constituted by meanings, it's made up of human acts of meaning. Um, but that doesn't mean it's not real, right? This kind of heavy skeptical implication that the constructed status makes it sub-real. Would deny that. Um, in fact, that's sort of where at the thing towards the end where he talks about um, the human sciences trying to understand human meanings, but not yet getting to the point where they can judge human meanings. What we saw in the earlier essays, especially in Origins of Christian Realism, right, is that Lonergan says that reality, being, is apprehended in judgments, and so one of the difficulties for a lot of contemporary human sciences or humanities, or if you, the German Geisteswissenschaften, is that they recognize that so many human realities are constituted by meaning, but they don't know what criteria you would use to judge meaning, right? They're they maybe have broken away, maybe they, or maybe not have broken away from the criteria of the world of immediacy, but there's not yet set out clearly a criteria for judging reality or unreality um, in the world mediated by meaning. So Lonergan takes a little detour, though, through the advent of the classical ideal of science, and he spends a little bit of time talking about Plato and Socrates. And one of the things that he thinks Socrates and Plato, maybe I should say Plato and Socrates through the writings of Plato, is getting at is trying to establish controls on meaning, right? That's the function of this second order realm of definitions that Socrates is always trying to get to. That being able to get a hold of the realm of ideas is a way of getting control on meaning, is a way of distinguishing um, myth from fact and magic from uh, prudence or practical control. And one of the uh, and so then the difficulty is that if you don't have that control, human meaning, he says, is what is the word he uses? I'm spacing out on the word he uses. Uh, ba, ba, ba. Oh, meaning is insecure because besides truth there is error, besides fact there is fiction, besides honesty there is deceit, besides science there is myth, right? And so if the goal, right, if the way of dealing with think of the begin very if you've ever read Plato's Republic, the very beginning of Plato's Republic has Socrates and the sort of well-to-do young men of Athens who hang out with him going down the hill from Athens to the Piraeus because there's a festival going on in the kind of port area of the Piraeus, and they want to go see scholars differ about what it is, whether it's a kind of um, uh, religious procession or whether it's a kind of a horse race. But anyway, there's this kind of thing with horses that's going to happen in the Piraeus, and they're really interested to go see it because the word on the street is that the Thracians do it just as well as the Athenians do. Um, and that's counter to expectations because with characteristic cultural chauvinism, the Athenian attitude is that Athenians are best at everything. And so to find out that these barbaric Thracians are just as good as us at doing this thing, well, that I got to see. Um, and so, one of the ways of dealing with the arbitrariness of cultural chauvinism and the arbitrariness of, and the seeming arbitrariness that is imposed by cultural difference, right? That it's not like ancient Athenians weren't aware that different cultures had different customs. One strategy for dealing with that is to try and that beyond just the kind of sophistic pursuit of naked power, was to search for the criteria by which to judge custom in physis, in nature. Um, and so part of what the control of meaning lets you do, right? If you can get uh, definitions for courage, for example, that covers all instances of courage and only courage. This is the Latin Lonergan uses, omni et soli, all and only, all instances of courage and only courage, right? You have a basis on which to make judgments about custom, right? Because you found the ground, the governing norm of custom in the nature that it rests upon, in the physis that it rests upon. Uh, and Lonergan thinks this is a real significant breakthrough, right? This recognition that meaning can function in two ways. It can function in the immediacy of the drama of living, where you and I can speak intelligently about the difference between courageous and cowardly action. But, right, if the critical question arises of, you praise that as courageous, is it? How do you know? What's the measure of courage? Well, if I can define courage with an omni et soli definition, right, then I can explain why the instance I'm thinking of fits under the definition. Now it's not courage as merely as a matter of opinion, pistis, or belief, doxa, but it's knowledge, right? I flipped that. Doxa, pistis, knowledge. The root there is like in epistemology. Flip my Greek roots, sorry. Um, and why is it pistis? Why is it knowledge? Because it's rooted in physis. It's rooted in nature. Um, the difficulty, though, once you recognize that the nature, the being even of courage or justice is not just mediated by meaning, but in its concreteness and its instantiation, when you realize that it's also constituted by meaning, right? That it's the product of social and cultural agreement. Um, well, now it's not as clear where you're going to derive your criteria, uh, your your ground, for those kinds of judgments, right? Um, and so part of what Lonergan is doing in this essay is he doesn't quite come out and say this, which I find a little bit interesting. Um, but he's posing a problem to the reader and to his audience. This was given as a talk originally. And this is from 1965, by the way. This is from May of 1965, which is like 2 or 3 months before he gets treated for lung cancer. So he doesn't know I mean, I think he was probably coughing a lot because he smoked a lot of cigarettes, but he didn't know how sick he was yet. He didn't know he was going to almost die that summer. Um, but yet, he's putting a problem to his audience, which is okay, if we're going to appreciate the way in which modern culture has made some big advances, both in the natural sciences, which he discusses a little bit, right? The difference between classical ideal of science and the modern ideal of science. But more importantly, in the human sciences, if we're going to recognize that the kind of reduction to natures, the analytic reduction to natures that classical science is engaged in is just no longer the operative ideal of science. But there's a qualitatively different ideal of science um, that isn't going to reduce things to their universal, necessary, and certain principles, but rather is going to investigate um, all the data on all human living everywhere and always in its concreteness, um, in an open-ended way. Well, sure, we can run around cataloging descriptions of all those things. Um, but in what, once you've moved into this empirical notion of culture as just whatever meanings and values inform, as a matter of fact, inform a way of life, um, is there any way to have a kind of modern Socratic enterprise where you find the ground of making judgments um, about what's a matter of fact and what's a myth, around what's authentically practical and what's magical thinking? Um, and part of the problem he's posing is that the people in the human sciences don't seem to know. Um, and he doesn't even touch right here, unlike in the essay on the absence of God in modern culture, he doesn't even touch on theology, right? We're just trying to figure out how you would make uh, correct judgments in the realm of that which is constituted by human meanings. He's not even touching on the problem of how you discern within the realm constituted by human meanings the communication of divine meanings, right? So you got he's not even touching on the problem of like you've got all these books collected into this canon of scripture, um, which we, as modern people know, were not just like written by particular persons, but were like written and redacted by whole communities of people over long periods of time. Um, how do you discern divine meaning in those expressions of human meaning, especially when those human meanings are not just the intentions of particular authors, but are the kind of aggregate and accumulated meanings of a kind of scholarly and editorial um, culture running over generations. It's a big problem. He didn't even touch it. He doesn't get into the theological problem here at all. He's just at the level of human meanings, right? So, um, in a way, we're taking a step back to say, like, yeah, the problem of absence of God in modern culture is a serious problem, but like, even if you go a step down, how do you how do you have a constructivist realism in the humanities in general, even if you bracket out theology as a discipline? Um, Give me just a second. Was there something else I wanted to say about that? Um, oh, sorry. Well, here. And then we talked about this last time, but it's interesting the way he concludes. So let's look at the conclusion, and then I want to open it up for questions. Um, so this is sort of this whole long last paragraph, and I'm starting on 244, which I think is the second to last page of the PDF. Give Paul a second to pull it up. So let's go, yeah, go up one more little bit right there. Here, I'll read it off mine over here. Uh, the crisis then that I have been attempting to depict, right? So he's framing it, here's a crisis, problem, question, difficulty. Is a crisis not of faith, but of culture. There has been no new revelation from on high to replace the revelation given through Christ Jesus. There has been written no new Bible. There has been founded no new church to link us with him. So here we have we see we were talking about this before, right? On the one hand, Lonergan is trying to be as thoroughgoing in his articulation of how significant, how radical, the intellectual challenge posed by modern culture is. But on the other hand, on matters, oop, did I freeze? I seem to have frozen. Oh, I'm back. Um, uh, on the other hand, when it comes to things that he views as core to matters of faith, revelation in Jesus Christ, Scripture, the church, he's quite you could say conservative, I guess. I mean, he really delineates these two things as being in separate compartments. And we can sort of investigate how well that delineation holds up if we want. Um, but Catholic philosophy and Catholic theology are matters not merely of revelation and faith, but also of culture, right? So he's saying there's a kind of mixed situation in terms of faith and culture not being kind of these two hermetically sealed arenas, right? Even though he distinguishes them quite strongly, Catholic philosophy, Catholic theology as intellectual disciplines are a mixture of the two. Both have been fully and deeply involved in classical culture. So here, think of scholasticism, neo-scholasticism. Um, Go ahead. That's fine. Retrieving a purse. She's very sorry. All right. The breakdown of classical culture and, at last in our day, the manifest comprehensiveness and exclusiveness of modern culture confront Catholic philosophy and Catholic theology with the gravest problems impose on them mountainous tasks, invite them to Herculean labors. Um, I really like that actually. Personally, I find that daunting but inspiring actually to be try to be honest about like how much work there is to do. Indeed, once philosophy becomes existential and historical, once it asks about man, meaning humanity, not in the abstract, not as we would be in some state of pure nature, but as in fact we are here and now in all the concreteness of our living and dying, the very possibility of the old distinction between philosophy and theology vanishes. Now, something to point out here, it doesn't mean that Lonergan thinks there is no distinction between philosophy and theology. He thinks the old distinction doesn't operate. Um, but that's a complicated question. I can point you to some lectures he gave where he explores that in more depth. Um, what is true of that distinction is true of others. What is true of distinctions also is true of each of the other techniques that mark the style and fashion, the fabric of our cultural heritage. Classical culture cannot be jettisoned without being replaced, and what replaces it cannot but run counter to classical expectations, right? So this is a kind of by the way criticism of certain kinds of too facile anti-modernism, right? If if modernism is just everything that runs counter to the expectations of classical culture, then anti-modernism in Catholic thought has to just be a repudiation of everything in the modern world. Um, and then it's not hard to see why that ultimately proved untenable, and there had to be something like Gaudium et Spes or something, the documents of Vatican II that came into a more dialectical relationship with modern culture. Um, there is bound to be formed a solid, we read this last time, there is bound to be formed a solid right determined to live in a world that no longer exists, which is to say this previous classical cultural world. There is bound to be formed a scattered left, captivated by now this, now that new development, exploring now this, now that new possibility, right? Partly here he's implying because it doesn't know how to judge meaning, right? It can play, it can take up in a kind of hypothetical mode all kinds of meanings that emerge in the permutations of modern culture, but it has difficulty being critical about those meanings. And so it has what did C.S. Lewis call it? Chronological snobbery, right? Whatever's old is out and whatever's new is in. But what will count is perhaps a not numerous center, big enough to be at home in both the old and the new, right? So it understands this transition. It's able to pivot, to transpose back and forth across the transition. Painstaking enough to work out one by one the transitions to be made, right? So it's aware of all the arenas and the details in which the transition is effective. from classical to modern culture. Strong enough to refuse half measures and insist on complete solutions, even though it has to wait. Um, which I think I mentioned last time. Those of us Lonerganiacs who are taken of Lonergan's outlook, that passage has become a kind of slogan or something, motto, cri de coeur. Okay. Anyway, I wanted to make sure I kind of hit the beats of what's going on here in this essay, and draw some of the connections with the previous essays we read. But now I would like to open it to whatever questions you either have occurred in the course of me talking for the last uh, 20 however minutes, or that you came in with from your reading.
So I was wondering on what he said about Socrates having to explain repeatedly what a definition was. Again and again, he would show that a good definition has to be omni et soli to apply to every instance of the defined and to no instance of something else.
Yep.
So I was wondering if that implies definitions can ever capture the essence, akin to like Aquinas on we can't know the essence of even like a fly, that sort of thing, that the propositional layer of knowledge is always insufficient because everything is relational and therefore kind of co-determining at least in the realm of contingency, which you could probably tie theologically to God as love is relational and therefore you can't capture any isolated definition, which I think Plato maybe that's part of the point of the dialogues is to reach that aporia. So I'm curious what Lonergan would think about those things.
I mean, Lonergan would say, as a matter of fact, we have reached all kinds of definitions. And it's not for nothing that it seems pretty clear that Socrates and Plato were influenced in their search for definitions by successes in ancient mathematics. Um, and so, kind of definitions of two-dimensional shapes in Euclidean geometry are like a classic example. Right, a circle is a set of coplanar points equidistant from a given center. It's a definition. Um, it covers all instances of circles and no instances of things that aren't circles. Now, that's highly abstract. So it in some ways is easier, right? Um, Something to notice about what Lonergan says about why Socrates has to keep telling people what he means by definition is that Lonergan thinks of the search for definitions as an intellectual technique. Um, and I think this is interesting, actually, that there emerge in the course of inquiry certain intellectual, well, two kinds of things, really, I think Lonergan would say, right? Um, there emerge techniques and there emerge theorems, which are sort of techniques are ways of proceeding, and then theorems are sort of formal relations that you can plug into different things you're trying to understand to see if they help you understand it. When I'm talking to my students about Nicaea, for example, I will tell them that, one of the achievements of Nicene Orthodoxy is the way that it adopts and adapts both both a Greek philosophical theorem, right, that of being, right, of essence of nature, but also a Greek philosophic technique, which is I characterize as exhaustive dichotomy, right? So, look, whatever begotten means, um, the Son is begotten and not made. Well, if creator and creatures is an exhaustive dichotomy, right? There's no third category. which the logic of Nicaea seems to sort of indicate, right? The visible and the invisible. Well, is there a third category between the visible and the invisible? Not really, no. Um, and so if the Father is Pantocratora, right, the maker of all things, and is omnipotent on the basis of being the maker of all things, um, and the Son is begotten, whatever that means, but not made, well, then there's only one other column to put the Son in, and that's maker. That's the deployment of a Greek philosophic intellectual technique. And so it's easy to notice the deployment of this category of homoousios in Nicaea, but you can overlook the way that the term is being deployed in the midst of also the use of this particular intellectual technique of setting up exhaustive dichotomies. Um, the search for definitions for omni et soli definitions, Lonergan thinks is the similar kind of thing, um, where it's an intellectual technique. And why do people stick with it? Because it works, um, right? When you can set out definitions, right? One of the places where this happens all the time is in law. Right? Define if you go to law school, one of the things you do in a lot of your classes is you kind of play define the category, right? You try to articulate a legal definition that will include all of the cases you want to include and not include any of the cases you don't want included. Um, and so, for Lonergan, when Lonergan was a young student, he characterized himself as a nominalist, because the neo-scholastic Thomists of his time were very preoccupied with universals. And the account they gave of how people know universals was intuitionist, that there was a kind of non-discursive, immediate encounter between the intellect and the universal in the thing. And that's sort of how concepts get into minds. And it's not a conscious process and it's not a discursive process. And so one of the things that Lonergan is trying to draw out here is the way in which um, the search for definitions, when one comes to a definition that is a correct definition, it's both a discovery, but it's also a kind of construction, right? This is why he can be both constructivist and realist, is that there's like I said, there's both a kind of making of definitions and there's also an element of discovery in definitions. Um, And I'm trying to think of a good, one example that I use sometimes is both Newton and Leibniz invent the calculus, the differential calculus, about the same time. Um, and it's the same mathematical technique in both instances, but they both express it using different notation. And one of them, somebody was explaining this to me, that one of them is sort of good for some stuff, and the other one is the calculus that you like learn in high school. Um, but right, so there's a kind of discovery of the calculus, but there's also a making involved, right? Such that um, the character of the calculus generated by Newton and the character of the calculus generated by Leibniz um, they're apt for different things as a result. So anyway, that's a bit of a long kind of on the one hand, on the other hand thing. But no, Lonergan would say uh, that particularly because knowledge he would quote Thomas all the time. True and false are in the mind, the good, but the good is concrete, which is a way of saying that um, judgments of fact or knowledge of facts is by abstraction. He says it takes an abstractive viewpoint, which is a way of saying that we know being through the mediation of meaning by getting correct answers to our questions. And so a it's both true that there will be true definitions, which are real apprehensions of being, but also that you can have a plurality of definitions that unfold through a genetic sequence of a developing science, different expressions in different cultural situations, um, subtle differences in how the question is posed, right? It's tricky. Lonergan's position is one that runs kind of was it orthogonal? Runs kind of across our common expectations, philosophic expectations of a kind of universal fixity or a kind of fluctual constructivist relativism. And Lonergan's position kind of runs across both of those in a way that's a little hard to get our heads around, which is maybe why my answer is so long-winded. But anyway, Connor, did that address what you were concerned about?
Yeah, that's helpful. And the method or the tendency of that orthogonal impulse across the two poles, I completely agree with. Actually, I think there's a decent amount of that in Charles Sanders' Peirce as well. But
Yeah.
I would wonder whether the definition, the capacity to form a definition, whether he would say, um, like between a fairly easy one to do in mathematics, in Euclid, his comment there of a circle, whether it's more on a spectrum between that and say a definition in the humanities of say courage, or whether you can, uh, or whether there is at some point one where you can't get an exhaustive definition, or what do you say? It's just like more difficult, or you can approach it from more angles, but you can still get a clear definition through the use of exhaustive dichotomies. So, yeah, can you still make the sharp distinction in definitions via that Greek technique, as you mentioned, even for more nebulous or humanities types topics?
Yeah. So one of the things um, that Socrates doesn't understand is that uh, Lonergan used to say concepts have dates, and one could say, if you want, also addresses. Um, that because because definitions operate uh, in the world mediated by meaning, and meanings are generated by human understandings. Um, that you could say their kind of ontological ground is human minds.
Mhm.
Um, and so as I should say this, their ontological ground as mediating is in human minds. Um, they also have another ground in what they mediate. But so for modern human sciences, then the difficulty is to come to correct judgments about the uh, what a definition meant to the either the author who defined it or in the community in which it was operative. Um, now, uh, that can look like two things, right? That can operate in the realm of common sense, where and this is like biblical scholars do this all the time, right? When biblical scholars do lexical analysis, and they try to give you a kind of semantic range of what a Hebrew or a Greek term meant. Um, Part of the reason they have to give you a semantic range is because they're kind of giving you the aggregates range of meanings for what that term sort of did in a particular community. Um, but if a community has differentiated the realm of what Lonergan and other places will call theory, which is to say a realm where you have this uh, the kind of controls on meaning where you can have omni et soli definitions, right? Like in mathematics, for example, or in physics. Um, right. So think of if I were a scholar, say, of 19th century anthropology, um, right? And there would be things which were definitions of, I mean, let's use the fraud example, right? Definitions of racial categories in 19th century anthropology, right? Um, they're aspiring to deploy this theoretical technique of having these omni et soli definitions. Um, but there you have the difficulty, right? This meaning is insecure. So part of it is that there's this misapprehension that there's some kind of basis in physis in nature for racial differences. And so you have different theories of, you have polygenic theories and you have monogenic theories of the human species and all this stuff, right? And so they're trying to do theory, um, but there's some inverse insights that haven't happened, right? And so on the one hand, I can make a judgment about, okay, here is how these anthropological definitions were operating in 19th century anthropology, right? What was Peirce's or not James's teacher's name? The guy who took him down the Amazon. Super racist 19th century anthropologist. I can't think of the guy's name. Anyway, very famous Harvard anthropologist guy. Um, that James studied under when he was still kind of in that world. Right? He's got all these racial categories and he's got definitions in them that are meant to be theoretical. So I can both make judgments about this is what his definitions meant in their own moment in time and situation. And then I can also do a criticism of the inadequacy of those definitions, right? Um, Such that we have modern anthropology and the various schools of modern anthropology have their own theoretical definitions for, breaking things out. Um, and Lonergan will say, what ends up happening because of the change in the ideal of science is that modern human sciences have come to not look for um, universal, necessary, and certain definitions, but rather they generate what Max Weber called ideal types. And your ideal types are true to the extent that they make sense of the data in your field. And so it's much more part of Lonergan's point is that the function of definitions has changed because the ideal of knowledge has changed. And so instead of being universal, necessary, and certain, now they have the function of types, and they can be revised if they need to on the basis of, whether they explain the data or not. So sorry, that was a little complicated, but maybe that's help, right? So there's both. So let me just repeat the three pieces because it's a little complicated. So there's making historical judgments about theory and other times and places, right? What was the definition of such and such for that community? There's making genetic determinations about the relative adequacy of those definitions with the benefit of hindsight. But then there's also the more significant thing, which is because the ideal of science has changed, what it means to look for definitions. The anticipation of what a definition is supposed to do has changed. Um, and that's really the thing that Lonergan wants people to get is this deeper thing, which is we're not looking for universal, necessary, and certain knowledge in the sciences anymore. We're doing a different thing. Um, and it functions differently.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So would he say though, regarding like Plato and Aristotle, that it wasn't until Aristotle, whom I recall he praised in a previous reading, um, that the omnia solely actually became successful because Aristotle used more exhaustive dichotomies, but at the same time, Aristotle still didn't take account of the historical development for constitutive meaning, and therefore he got part of it right. But
Yeah, so Aristotle makes an advance insofar as he thinks Aristotle has a different intellectual technique aside that's not exhaustive dichotomy. He thinks Aristotle's big discovery is what he calls implicit definition, where the terms in his theories all reciprocally define each other, um, and that makes them sort of properly theoretical. So this is something that's sometimes a complaint against Aristotle, right? Um, what's the soul in De Anima? The soul in De Anima is the principle of a living body, which is to say, it's the thing that makes bodies alive as distinct from dead. Um, I read an article a long time ago, a scholarly article about Aristotle that called the, they said, people talk about the mind-body problem and they don't advert enough to the body-body problem, which is why is one of these bodies alive and one of them dead? And now on the one hand, that's a totally empty definition, right? the soul is the principle of a living body. It's totally heuristic. It's whatever it is that makes living things alive and not dead. It's what's missing when all you have is a dead body. Right? That's empty. But part of the reason it's empty is because it's meant to be heuristic, right? It's a part of a scheme of distinguishing different ways of being alive, right? So you have vegetative souls and you have sensitive souls and you have rational souls. And so if you just take that piece out of the scheme it's fit into, it means very little, but it can mean actually quite a lot when it's controlling the meaning of other terms like vegetative, sensitive, and rational. Um, so anyway, but anyway, that's a detail I'm being distracted by. Your main thrust of your comment is correct. That yes, he thinks Aristotle makes this breakthrough in a way that makes scientific definitions more readily available than Plato and Socrates could manage. But on the other hand, yeah, um, he doesn't have an ideal of a historically minded science.
Hmm.
Science is a kind of knowledge that gets you out of the fluctual change of history. Um, for politics, for ethics, it can approximate the science, but really a lot of it's so contingent that mostly you just have to be prudential.
Hmm. Uh, okay, yeah, that's helpful. One other point I just had was I feel like the description you made of discovery and reconstruction
Mhm.
as being simultaneous with Lonergan reminded me of the concept of inventio in St. Augustine, where it refers to the first canon of rhetoric, which it's like the process of discovering and developing arguments or ideas like simultaneously in a certain sense. That I don't know if Nate's here, but I know John Vervaeke has used a lot that concept. Anyway, sorry I took up a lot of time, but thank you.
No, no, no. But they're questions at the heart of the thing. So yeah, good. Okay. Andrew's got a question in the chat on 233, page 2 of the PDF. Lonergan says, yet the whole of that added, man-made, artificial world is so the world constituted by meaning is the cumulative, now planned, now chaotic product of human acts of meaning. How does Lonergan conceive of sin in this description? Sin is a human act of meaning, but it is also absurd, true, and so without intelligibility. How does Lonergan relate those in the description of dimensions of meaning? Good, that's a good question. Um, Lonergan is a thoroughgoing, even radical proponent of the what's known as the privatio boni theory of evil, where what evil is the privation of some good, and privation is different than just absence. Um, so the mind of God is the important measure here. So something which God intent, some good which God intended, and when we speak of malum culpa, culpable evil, human evil, sin per se, um, that it's some good which God intended a human person to be responsible for bringing about, and the sin is not whatever they do instead of the good they were responsible to bring out. But the sin per se, the culpable evil per se, is the failure to do that good thing that they were responsible for in God's eternal intention for them. Um, and that's really important. Lonergan thinks, for example, making God not be the author of evil, right? God's intention for his free creation is that human beings should cooperate with God to bring about good um, in the unfolding of creation, uh, and human moral failure, the human decision not to do things that are obligatory for us is what evil is what moral evil is what sin is. Um, but human beings live and move and have our being in a world mediated and constituted by meaning. And so sometimes uh, sin takes the form. Lonergan, in an essay called The Dialectic of Authority, he talks about something called the sin of backwardness, which is not like a canonically defined sin or anything, but he's suggesting something that uh, that to live that he will speak sometimes of living at the level of one's times. That one has a responsibility um, in the course of being responsible for the good things that God gives you the privilege of being the agent of in God's creation, um, one needs to understand the moral circumstances in which one has to bring them about. And um, the failure to take responsibility for the cultivation of one's own understanding and to generate the meanings that would constitute the good for which one is responsible would be a kind of would be a sin. And so one of the things that if you follow me on Blue Sky, I say all the time is that not all stupidity is evil, but all evil is stupid. Um, because the human good is mediated and very often constituted by meaning, and meanings have their origin in human understanding. And so if you fail to take up the task of some good thing, which is your responsibility to do, you're then not having the insights, you're not having the understandings that would be integral to the realization of that good thing for which you are responsible. Um, and so failing to pursue and enact those things um, means that you're also failing to have those insights. And so you're being stupid. You're in the literal sense. You are diminishing your own intelligence. This is a psychological way of articulating what people more traditionally in theological programs learn about as the transcendentals of being, right? That the true and the good are coextensive as a metaphysical matter. These are the kind of psychological dynamics and consequences of that metaphysical affirmation, which Lonergan is a kind of traditional Thomist in that regard. Just one second. Yes.
Um, me and Matt, me and Joey and May are going to remember those slide things?
Hmm.
We're gonna go to one of those things.
Okay. Why don't you tell mommy about that?
Sure, sure.
Okay, then go. Important updates. Um, Hold on. And my wife is texting me. Oh, no, we're good. Okay. So, now this is an interesting this is forgive me if I've talked about this before, but right now I'm preoccupied with it in Lonergan. That Lonergan two times in his life, early in his life and then later towards the end of his life, wrote works in macroeconomics. And part of the reason for that um, was that he saw, and he says this in an essay called Moral Theology and the Human Sciences. He uses this as an example. He says, look, there's extrinsic critique where the magisterium of the church generates encyclicals about Catholic social teaching where it says that enterprises need to pay a living wage. Sorry, hold on. Hey, baby, I'm teaching a class. I can't. No, I'm sorry. Someone else will have to help you. Um, uh, Rerum Novarum and the like will say that enterprises need to pay a family wage to, I think I said this before, right? That and to Catholic families at that. And but the problem is if you have an economic system in which the enterprises that do that go out of business, well, like, yeah, you can tell them that they're morally obligated to pay a family wage all you want, but then every enterprise that flouts that moral expectation stays in business, and all the ones that don't go out of business. I know nobody's getting a living wage, so good on you. And so Lonergan wrote these works of macroeconomic analysis because he thought what was needful was advance in understanding of economic theory that could guide the construction of economic systems that would enable enterprises to pay living wages in accord with the moral expectations set out by Catholic social teaching, right? And so there's a way in which you can talk about cultural or social sin as the community failure to generate in the course of its way of life the the kinds of understandings that would facilitate the cooperative generation of a just social or cultural order. Um, And that's obligatory on the community to do as a moral matter, and their failure to do that is sin. It's a kind of social or cultural mode of sin, which is an interesting way of dealing with the rather tricky problem of um, whether there can be um, collective moral responsibility. But anyway, that's a little more than you asked for, but hopefully that gives you some sense, Andrew, of the role of meaning in the problem, the mystery of iniquity, as the Bible has it.
All right,
So,
and just can I just ask one quick follow-up,
please.
which just so that the lack of insight is both the insight as to grasping the terms and relations, right? But also the insight about judging, right? About
Yeah.
judgment. Because I can grasp adequately whatever the terms and relations of the circumstance are, right? And then I make a decision that because I value X over Y, I'm going to ignore that, right? So that's
Right.
or I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Inauthenticity, as Lonergan will call it in method, can happen kind of all down the line.
Sure.
It's one of the values to me of
I'm
his
really good at it myself.
yeah, of years of practice personally. But one of the values of Lonergan's theory of knowledge as being the coordination of different levels of conscious operations is that when something has gone wrong, right? When there's some misapprehension or your plan isn't working, it gives you this nice breakout of the various levels to try to figure out where where things are going wrong. Now, it might be going wrong in multiple places, but you can kind of go through and cattle, right? Is there data I didn't pay attention to that I should have paid attention to? Or is there some question I should be asking that I haven't formulated yet? Or maybe there's some question I formulated and I didn't stick with it. I didn't get an adequate answer to it, right? Or right, maybe I settled on an answer, but that answer is incorrect because I didn't marshal all the data the way I should have, right? Or maybe I did all that stuff, and the problem is really a problem of an existential problem of freedom. That I knew what was going on, I knew what needed to be done, I knew that I needed to be the one who did it, and I just wasn't willing. I looked at it and I went, nope, mm-mm, right, not going to be me. Right? I mean, there's myriad opportunities for that to happen in the world. So,
All right. And then I'm sorry, just real quick, the relationship between sin and bias, but is bias is not necessarily sinful, but it's a inadequate
yeah, it's like a
uh
vice. I mean,
what's that?
in the old, in the old metaphysical moral
Yeah.
theology or moral scheme, it's kind of like intellectual vice.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a
Thank you.
kind of bad habit.
Yep, gotcha. Thank you.
So I had one other follow-up on that. So if sin is completely of omission, I'm wondering if that would uh, not eliminate a kind of hierarchy of evils or sins, like e.g., mortal versus venial.
Oh yeah.
I don't know if you've
Uh,
ever addressed that or had that question.
yeah, I don't know. No, because I mean, on one level, one of the ways, what it does is it shifts the primary and proximate criterion of moral failure to the interiority of the moral actor. And so rather than begin with like a hierarchical cosmic order, the way that you see in some medieval moral theologies, right? Or even Renaissance moral theologies, where the sort of relative badness of things has to do with the kind of great chain of being, is kind of correlated to the great chain of being on the object side. Rather here, what you would have is an analysis that has happens on the side of the consciousness of the moral subject. And so, right, uh, I might um, I might through a kind of intellectual laziness not do my due diligence to understand my moral circumstances, and so thereby fail to do the good that was obligatory of me, right? Um, Lonergan's got a great line that I trot out all the time about how inadequate knowledge, when paired with fine moral feelings, tends to generate what's called moral idealism, which manifests itself in well-intentioned plans that end up doing more harm than good. Um, so that can happen at that, but it can also happen, like I was just talking to Andrew about, it can happen at the level of, no, 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 you've thought it all the way through. You know exactly what you're responsible to do and how you need to do it. Um, and you can just refuse. You can resent the imposition. Uh, and there's a way in which you could say, now you could do this a couple ways, right? You could say that's worse um, than the kind of uh, culpable ignorance that I described before. Um, but it actually becomes more interesting, right? Because you can do it the way that like Kierkegaard does in The Sickness Unto Death, where uh, in a weird way, as you get a better grip of your moral on your the stakes of your moral circumstance, your situation sort of gets worse. It's like you're both making sort of developmental advance on the problem, but because you're making that advance, you're sort of now there's even more on the line. So you know uh, you can have quite a subtle moral psychology on the basis of this. Um, which is to say, I don't know that it would do away with those hierarchies or distinctions, but it would put them on a different basis. Yeah. Um, full disclosure, this is being recorded, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm not the hugest fan of the current, at least in Catholic moral theology, the sort of canonical way of talking about venial and mortal sin and sort of how that fits in with the sort of apparatus of grace dispensation. It's not my favorite. I think it has some problems. Um, but it is the way things are at the moment. So anyway,
Okay. So my question is about a tension that I sense in two parts of the text where I'm trying, I want you to help me figure out what Lonergan actually means so I don't take him the wrong way. But
sure.
we have in early on in the text, we have um a section where he talks about myth and magic as instances of meaning, and then he gives basically a genealogy of what I would call the withdrawal of participation that kind of like lines up pretty fairly, but he seems to celebrate. He seems to celebrate it as a good thing, which I would say that
Sorry,
like
celebrate what is a good thing?
the withdrawal participation as a good thing. And just as an unqualified good with no sense that it also brings that it also brings tragedy. But then later on in the text,
Can I pause you just for a second though? Because
yeah, go ahead.
I don't quite know what that locution means. The
Okay,
withdrawal.
sure, no problem. I'll go back. I'll actually read the text and then explain it. Okay.
Great.
I was trying to take up as little time as
No, no, no.
possible in
Please, you got
framing the
time.
question, but I actually have the relevant text highlighted. So this is the text I'm talking
Nate,
about.
if you could tell me the where you're at, I'll
Yeah, it is on page 237 and it flows over onto page 238. Middle of the page with the first sentence is now myth and magic. It's the second paragraph on page 237.
is that it?
Yeah. I don't know. I have it pulled up on my own screen, so hold on a second here. Let me yes, now myth and magic. That's the right one. Okay. So now myth and magic are both instances of meaning. Myth is a declarative meaning, magic is an imperative meaning, but the declaration of myth is mistaken and the command of magic is vain. Both have meaning, but the meaning is meaning gone astray. The prevalence then of myth and magic among primitives and its survival, even in the ancient high civilizations, reveal the importance of the Socratic enterprise. The mediation of meaning is not idle talk, but a technique that puts an end to idle talk. It is not a vain subtlety, but a cure for the malady to which all men are prone. Just as the earth, left to itself, can put forth creepers and shrubs, bushes and trees, and such excessive abundance, there results an impenetrable jungle. So too the human mind, led by imagination and affected and uncontrolled by any reflexive technique, luxuriates in a world of myth with its glories to be achieved and its evils banished by charms of magic.
Mhm.
So it is that in Western culture for the past 24 centuries, the movement associated with the name of Socrates and the achievement of the fourth century Athens have been regarded as a high point, as a line of cleavage, as a breaking through of a radically new era in history of man. Now, that is what he's talking about there is what Barfield would call the withdrawal of participation, because
Okay.
magic and myth are both deeply rooted in our capacity for participatory knowing, and they're not. There's nothing propositional about them at all, right? So
Okay.
it's a shift. So it's a. But here's the thing, though, and I think he acknowledges this. If we, so can you scroll down a little bit onto the next page? Let's see. He says you repeat when yeah, okay, so but in the years between 800 and 200 BC, during that period in Greece, Israel, Persia, China, India, and China, man came of age. He set aside the dreams and fancies of childhood and began to face the world as perhaps it is. That's this line. Barfield places the also places the beginnings of the withdrawal participation in the axial age, so that much they're lined up. But here's the thing, though. What's missing here in this account in this section is any sense of that when we lose myth and magic, that we actually are losing meaning. That this
Oh yeah.
withdrawal participation actually ends up. He's actually talked. It's interesting. What he wrote this in 65, you said?
Yeah.
So he's actually diagnosing the meaning crisis in this essay,
Yeah.
and very well. But what I'm trying to understand is whether he would understand the connection between the death of myth and magic and participation in relation to that meaning crisis. And there's a section later on that makes me think maybe he might. It's right. This is on, okay, so this one is on page
I think I know what
240,
you're.
bottom
Yeah.
of page 241. Um, to proclaim with Vico the priority of poetry is to proclaim that the human experience expresses itself in symbols before it knows, if it ever knows, what its symbols literally mean. It is to open the way to setting aside the classical definition of man as a rational animal and instead defining man with the cultural phenomenologist as a symbolic animal with the personalist as an incarnate spirit. So the 20th century has witnessed a rediscovery of myth, and the rediscovery has taken many forms.
Yeah. And then he does that long. He gives you that kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
grocery.
and yeah, he like talks about Freud and Jung, etc.
Yeah.
And I think that's like and that's only accelerated because I think in our time we're seeing even an acceleration of the return of the mythical and enchanted view of
Right.
the world. And I think that we're seeing that precisely because it's a response to the extremity we reached in the withdrawal participation. Like you were talking about those 19th century anthropology. It's like to me, like the darkest hour of the withdrawal participation was 19th century.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So hold on, let me see if I can find uh I'm just looking for one more thing. Now maybe an initial thing to say um is well here. So the very last thing he ends with here
mhm.
is with recur. And
Right,
I think he's ending with recur on purpose. I don't know that for sure. He might just be giving you a list. But uh I think he's ending with recur because I think he wants to say that this is sort of um uh I think he's giving you a list in terms of increasing adequacy for dealing with the modern return to myth.
right,
Because what he's trying to draw out here, I think, is that all these people, it's interesting, all these people here are doing theories of myth and magic.
right,
Right. So it's not that you don't have that thing of um it's Wittgenstein maybe has the thing where it's like, well, the sun doesn't really rise in the east and set in the west. Instead, the earth rotates and such. And I think Wittgenstein's line is, well, how else would it look? Right? Like
yeah,
or the thing that Lonergan likes using sometimes is the beginning of Arthur Eddington's the lectures he gave. Anyway, these famous lectures that the physicist Arthur Eddington gave, where he talks about the two tables that he's writing his lectures on, and one of them is brown and solid, and he can put his mug on it, and the other one is like mostly empty space, with some like waves and fields and stuff. Uh, and the sort of coincidence of these two realms of meaning uh, in one's engagement with the world. Um, and so instead of just having, the full banishment of myth and magic and symbol, to only have a kind of purely theoretical engagement with reality,
Hmm.
Lonergan's noting that one of the things that modern culture does is uh, and notice that that would be a kind of residue of the classical ideal of science, right? That what science gives us is this kind of purely theoretical apprehension of reality as reality really is, which is a kind of forgetting of the abstractness of science.
Right.
Um, and so then you banish as false or as illusory or whatever, these other kinds of apprehensions of reality. But modern science doesn't do that, right? That's his big thing is no, no, no. Like the thing that's replacing classical culture is counter to classical expectations. It's not a reduction of the contingent and fluctual to the sure and certain and necessary and universal. But rather, these things are kind of going hand in hand. The contingent and the particular and the necessary and the ideal, we're pivoting back and forth between them all the time. Okay, so anyway, that's all preamble. So here he's giving you these various ways of theorizing about myth, magic, and symbol. And I think I would have to look at it and really think about it, but I think they're in ascending levels of adequacy to recur. Um, who discerns the dialectic in which older and less adequate symbols of guilt are complemented, corrected, modified, and still retained in combination with newer ones. Um, and I think too, the first thing I was thinking of when you asked this question also is that Lonergan is going to be like Recur, and in fact, in Method, he invokes Recur to this point of thinking of a kind of passage through a critical, um, uh, uh, a kind of critical phase, but that's ordered to second naivete.
Hmm.
That would be much more the way that Lonergan would go,
Okay.
much more so than the kind of re-enchantment crowd.
Right.
Uh, that no, 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 the way that you deal with this problem of the seeming evacuation of the gods from the world is not to uh, pull back from this critical enterprise as a mistake, but actually to push all the way through it
Yeah.
until it can be luminous for you. It can
I think
become.
that's actually aligned with Barfield too, because Barfield's like the entire point of final participation is that it's not original participation. So
Mhm.
Barfield would be in agreement that like original participation, although it had its benefits for us, ultimately was something we had to move out of.
Yeah.
And so what distinguishes final participation from original participation, which Barfield, by the way, also equates with paganism on a 1-to-1 ratio.
Oh, interesting.
In Saving the Appearances, he actually says you could just call it paganism, right? So it's the development of the self-consciousness that leads to final participation. So in original participation, people would just have the feeling of being possessed by the forces, right?
Yeah.
And having no agency. Whereas in the final participation, it's a self-conscious re-engagement,
Yeah.
which is definitely different than a if you could it's a way of understanding re-enchantment, but it's a re-enchantment that isn't just endorsing falling under the spell of things, right?
Yeah. Good. Yeah.
Maybe like enchantment, like the original meaning of enchantment is something like sing into being. So
Mhm.
like Barfield's idea of final participation can fit that idea of enchantment, but certainly not like the enchantment that is like where you've lost your agency is definitely not a good thing.
No, yeah, not it's not going to be fairies in the garden stuff. Yeah. Good. Other questions along this line or others?
I have a question, sort of related to earlier, whenever you were talking about his macroeconomics. Um, I was wondering, like, how he would negotiate, like, the fact value distinction within, like, the humanities. Um, because, like, the way that you kind of like briefly described it, it seems like he would like believe that you can kind of investigate economics as like an autonomous entity. Like, the economy is like a system with just like a set of rules, completely devoid of like any extrinsic moral judgments. Um, and yeah, I was just like wondering if you could maybe expand upon that.
Yeah, I mean, no, I mean, uh, for Lonergan, I had maybe I'm repeating myself, so forgive me if I am, but I had for a long time thought I knew that Lonergan had written these works of economics, economic analysis, and I'd always thought of it as a kind of self-indulgent hobby of his or something, just like this thing he tinkered on in the garage. Um, but more and more, I've come to see it as really integrated with his philosophy and theology of history. And his big concern, at least if Fred Lawrence's introduction to the earlier essay is to be believed, um, that for Lonergan, his concern with economics was really a concern about democratic politics. That he looked at the situation in his own lifetime. You got to remember he goes to college in England in the 20s and he comes home to Canada in 1930 and it's in the depths of the Depression and there's 200,000 Canadians out of work. And the government's trying to do something, but most of the policy ideas he's smart enough to know are probably going to make the inflation worse and he doesn't exactly know why, but he's like he's got enough of a head for math that he's pretty confident it will. Um and and then from there, right, within a couple of years, he goes to Europe and not just Europe, he goes to Rome in the 30s, right? He goes to a fascist country. And in fact, he spends a couple of his summers while he's in Rome in the villa of the German Jesuits. Um, getting into arguments. It's sort of implied in Bill Matthews' biography. It's implied that he's getting into arguments with the German Jesuits because he keeps poking at their nationalism. Um, and ultimately he's not able to defend his dissertation in a timely manner because the war gets so hot he has to leave Rome. Um, and Uh, so he saw up close the way in which economic blunders affected um, politics and in anti-democratic ways. Either, in one direction, um, the heads of enterprise so insist on their autonomy he was horrified by the Irish famine, because he was reading the newspapers and these English politicians were saying, well, no, 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 us politicians cannot interfere with the iron laws of supply and demand, right? And meanwhile, like Irish people are dying by the thousands. Um, and Irish communities are being gutted by emigration and all these kinds of things. And so he was really morally horrified by that, right? He found that kind of um, hardcore classical liberalism to be really disturbing. On the other hand, he saw up close fascistic nationalization of the economy and saw what a disaster that was. He also then, right, he also gets to see the post-war rise of the Soviet Union as a kind of countervailing force to American liberalism. and that politically centrally planned economy he thought was a disaster too. And so he does not see, anyway, this is a long-winded way of saying he does not see economics as some kind of like enclosed sphere of like purely mechanical. He sees it as having a realm of its own proper autonomy, but one that is interfacing with A, the standard of living in a community, and B, the political structures that help govern the standard of living for the community. Um, and so he thinks, when economic circumstances get out of kilter, it knocks those other things offline as well. And so it's actually precisely because he sees it as integrated with those other things that he wants to zoom in and try and understand that part on its own terms so that it can kind of more soundly play its function in this great complicated web of human history and human life. Now, as to the fact value distinction, um, Lonergan would say the fact distinction is real as a distinction, but it's an abstract one, right? And so it is to ask whether something is the case and to ask whether something is good and worthwhile are related questions, but distinct questions. Um, they are they're abstract, right? They select for different aspects of reality. I said earlier, he affirms the transcendentals of being, right? He affirms that the good and the true are in re in being coextensive. So he again, this is one of those things where like he kind of goes orthogonally across poles of common disagreement. Right? He both affirms the fact value distinction, but he would deny fact value separation, if that's maybe a more succinct way of putting it. And somebody hit something in the chat. Did you want to follow up with that at all, Michael?
No, that definitely helps me understanding how it like connects to other disciplines. Um, like so I guess like last week you kind of like talked about like the theorem of the supernatural, and I'm not like super um informed on these debates between Blundell and Lubach and all this sort of stuff. But you were like talking about like the way in which
Oh, you just muted yourself, I think, by accident. Oh,
sorry.
that's okay.
You're talking about like the way that like culture is supernatural to like society and like these sorts of distinctions.
Yeah.
So I guess like would there be like a similar relationship between like economics and other disciplines
Yep.
or
Very good. So the way Lonergan sees it is that so this is what I mean about intellectual techniques that I was talking about before, right? Lonergan sees the theorem of the supernatural as the set kind of formal relation, and part of his intellectual technique is to deploy it to try to explain different relationships between relatively autonomous but nevertheless related um, entities or orders. And so, yeah, the cultural order is relatively autonomous with regard to the what he would call the social order. Um, but they're still obviously connected, right? They're obviously influence each other. And big social changes will change culture, and big cultural changes will change the social order, um, as one can read the newspaper and discover. Lonergan broke down he made internal distinctions within the realm he called the social into technology, economy, and polity. And those also have a relationship of being relatively supernatural to each other, right? So that um, advances in technology improve the sort of relative efficacy of our labors. And technology here is meant broadly, not just digital technology, obviously, because he's writing it in 1950, whatever. Um, Economy then is a division of labor, which allows the advances in efficacy of technology to be compounded through um, some people go and collect the hemp fibers so that they can give them to the people who weave the fishing nets so that they can give them to the fishermen to take out and get more fish to feed everybody, right? That's economic division of labor compounding advances in fishing technology. And then polity is relatively supernatural with regard to economy, so that if your economic arrangements get sufficiently complicated that you can't just do it by ad hoc mutual agreement, it can become someone's job in the division of labor to make decisions about how the division of labor should proceed and under what circumstances. Um, but obviously, right, if they do a crappy job so that the economic situation that they set up, the division of labor they set up makes the technology break down because they over harvest the hemp and now our nets are breaking and we don't have anything to repair them with, and now we can't feed the growth in population that our nets provided. Well, buddy, you better believe the political circumstances are going to change eventually. um, so yeah, does that help you see sort of the Russian nesting dolls of how he's schematizing that?
Yeah, yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Another question from Andrew. Did Lonergan ever deal with the gospel church disapproval of usury in his cogitation on economics? That's a good question. I don't know. He was very interested in particularly in the role of finance in modern economics. Um, and I haven't spent enough time with those documents to know uh how if he ever sort of comments on, like, hey, we have a whole social order that's predicated on the what used to be called usury. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
So I had another question on Vico, which was just the fact that I know I assume he's praising by and large Vico's distinction or definition of humans as proclaiming the priority of poetry, which it reminded me. So first, whether he is kind of doing that in a um, non-qualified way. It reminded me that I think it was Ratzinger in his introduction of Christianity actually also put a key turning point in modernity with Vico, where he sort of says that it's a shift from the logos preceding ethos, which Romano Guardini also talked about, into like a homo faber, like man the maker, as opposed to receiving reality first. And I know John Milbank also kind of lionizes Vico for this shift.
Yeah.
So those various figures in dialogue, I'm wondering where Lonergan would fit in.
Yeah, I mean, Lonergan's interesting. I wrote an article a long time ago, back when uh, Chris Simpson was the editor of the Radical Orthodoxy Journal. I think the title was something like how Lonergan studies and radical orthodoxy have failed to get along and why they should. And my basic my basic pitch was precisely on this kind of constructivist point, that Milbank and Lonergan are both they both see the factum, the made, the constructed, or in Lonergan's terms, sort of that which is constituted by meaning, as maybe the site of theological reflection for modern theology. And both the share and the rejection of this idea that that which is constructed or made or constituted by meaning is somehow thereby de facto secular and atheological, right? They agreed that that's nonsense. Um, uh, I think Milbank's effort to how do I characterize it? This question about judging meanings, right? About judging that which is, especially that which is not just mediated by meaning, but constituted by meaning, right? Which has its ontological status in and as meaning. Um, right. I think both Lonergan and Milbank are concerned with judging meaning. Um, I think they have radically different criteria by which to judge meaning. Um, my own professional judgment is I find Milbank's criteria for judging meaning question begging, um, or special pleading or something. Um, that he has a tendency to just declare certain meanings to be the right ones, um, and so then gives them special status to be the criterion by which other meanings are judged. Um, and I find that now I don't think he would have any problem with me saying that that's subcritical because I don't think he has any interest in being critical. I think he thinks that's a kind of philosophical mistake to try to be critical in that kind of way. Um, I think he's wrong about that, but that is what he thinks, and so I don't think there's any kind of internal inconsistency in him taking that position. But I find it wanting. It's a reason I stopped reading Radical Orthodoxy and kept reading Lonergan. That's one theologian's opinion, so um, take it for what it's worth. But that's where I come down on that thing. But I think you're right to put your finger on Vico, and on this idea of the sort of symbolic and the mediation of and constitution of meaning as being a shared locus for these various figures trying to contend with the position of theology in modern culture. Yeah, I think that's right. I think you've got your finger on the right hinge point.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So do you think he would have some sympathy for Ratzinger's concern about the shift from logos to like poetic making as the priority for culture and knowing? Um,
I mean, to be honest, I think he would probably criticize Ratzinger for being, and I think this is evidenced in um, Ratzinger's as Benedict his retreat from some of the more historically minded things that, for example, John Paul II says in Fides et Ratio. Um, JP2 in Fides et Ratio very gently um, keeps the Hellenistic patrimony um, uh, uh, of Christendom of sort of Christendom's tradition, Western Christendom's tradition. He very gently emphasizes its kind of permanent significance for Christian tradition, but he's much more open to people have questions everywhere. People generate philosophies from everywhere to try and deal with these human questions, and the gospel can interface with that. And he's much more historically minded than Ratzinger. Benedict really doubles down on this I'm stumbling over my words here a little bit, but the what would I call it? The indispensability, the essentialness, the the permanent centrality of Hellenistic thought for Christianity, in a way that Lonergan, I think, would say there's a kind of residue of a classical view of culture here that's hasn't been worked all the way through in certainly in Benedict's encyclicals and things like that. Um,
right, like
did
when
you,
Benedict in his
sorry, go ahead.
Regensburg, when in Benedict's Regensburg address saying that like Christianity is the guardian of metaphysics for this, which was really helpful for me actually because I came back into the church through philosophy. So
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
interesting.
it's yeah, I find he's sort of, I mean, my own judgment, he's sort of not wrong in some ways, but I find JP2's sort of subtler dealing with that a little more adequate. Um, but yeah, so yeah, I do think that Lonergan would probably now on the other hand, Ratzinger's concern for maintaining the place of doctrine and dogma in Catholic life, Lonergan, I think, very clearly would have said, this is important. We'll see, we're going to read, uh, no worries, Connor. We'll read next time uh, some more of Lonergan's sort of Christological interventions um, that, yeah, Lonergan was very keen not to have. Um, this kind of facile separation of existential and pastoral versus doctrinal and cognitive that was kind of in the air after the council. He really wanted to try and hold those two things together. He didn't want any to let people really break them apart and chuck the doctrinal piece. Um, so I think on that point, he would have been gratified to see the direction in which Benedict went. But I do think on the philosophical point, I think he would have found him classicist in Lonergan's own sense of that term. All right, how much time we have left? We got 15 or 20 more minutes. Any other stuff we wanted to talk about in here that I didn't touch on? Yeah.
I just remind you, Jonathan, that you probably already know John did raise a question with you by
I
email.
may not have seen it. Did you email me?
I'm here now.
Oh, hey. Oh, I see your email. Well, here, why don't go ahead. What were you going to ask rather than me read it?
Yeah, so I'd be really curious to hear you talk about AI and human intelligence. And what made me think of it was the quote where it's like an old-fashioned man of prudence versus the new technological devices that facilitate knowing.
Yeah.
He comments on that in that art. So, yeah, like where do you see opportunities for cultural progress and the relationship between AI and human intelligence? Where do you see decline? What's the relationship like? What do you think Lonergan would say?
Yeah. Um, I think Lonergan would be really fascinated by this is a weird way to place to start on this, but it's what leapt to mind immediately. Lonergan would be really fascinated by the function of statistical intelligibilities and the operation of, for example, large language models. Um, one of the things that I impress upon my students is like large language models because they operate around um, this kind of linear algebra governed by a set of statistical parameters. Um, there's a certain way in which whatever it's going to generate in response to the prompt you put to it is going to be a kind of reversion to a mean. And so it's going to, by definition, be sort of average. And so if you have any interest in like being exceptional or excellent or, being an outlier, is that Malcolm Gladwell's The Outlier thing? I don't know. Um, you know, heavy reliance on AI is going to put you in the middle of the pack. Now, look, if you're busting your ass to try to get up to the middle of the pack, baby, will take all the help you can get. Um, but if, so part of me thinks that there's um, there would be something interesting about the statistical nature of what it puts out, what it generates. Um, Now, part of that difficulty there is that its outputs are entered into the aggregate of what is then statistically um, managed by the machine. And so you do have the Habsburg AI problem, which is that some AI models begin to train on their own outputs. Um, and that can cause corruptions of the well, the genetic analogy is maybe apt. Um, so that's a danger in terms of the statistical part of it. I think Lonergan, and there are people who are working. There's an Italian guy named Stephen Umbrello who's writing on Lonergan and AI. He's written a number of articles for Barron's Word on Fire blog about Lonergan and AI. In fact, the Lonergan Review is going to publish one of his articles here coming up pretty soon. Um, there's a very, very smart guy who is at uh, is it Marymount? something or other in Baltimore. Anyway, the guy's name is Taylor Nutter, and he's worked really hard to sort of investigate AI from a philosophical and theological advantage using Lonergan. Um, he's worked really hard to understand how they work, much more deeply than I understand how they work. Um, Mount St. Mary's, that's what it's called. Thanks, Josh. I forgot that you guys know each other. Um, but so he's worked really hard to wrap his head around that technical piece of it. The thing that I always anyway the Lonerganian thing. Who knows if Bernie would have pushed this himself, but the Lonerganian thing that I always push is how does one distinguish between a process that is intelligible and a process that is intelligent? Um, and my worry is that a lot of the people who are bullish on learning machine learning, that question doesn't even make sense to them. Um, let alone to be able to begin to answer it, they don't comprehend what the question is asking. Um, because you have to have some self-appropriation. You have to have some facility with the concrete data on your own intelligence to be able to know the difference between your apprehensions through self-appropriation of an intelligent process, the process of your own mind, and merely intelligible processes, what Lonergan sometimes will call natural processes. Um, so that's, I think, one place where uh, the the Sturm over AI uh, sheds light on the widespread, as Lonergan would say, oversight of insight um, that the alienation people have from the root of their own intelligence. Um, I don't know. I kind of feel like I'm beating around the bush. Is this sort of the sort of thing you were wondering about?
Yeah, exactly. Because I talk to some people and see some people that think AI is intelligent or is becoming intelligent, and then some people saying that's not only is that not happening, that's not possible.
I mean, one of the
So
big, I mean, even if you buy into the the idea which I'm critical of, but nevertheless, let's for the sake of argument, let's stipulate that the metaphor, the analogy for understanding intelligence in terms of the mind and body problem is that there is some kind of software, which is our consciousness, which runs on the hardware, which is a lot of people say our brains. I mean, people like Alan Shore and probably Stephen Porges is a better example in interpersonal neuropsychology have made the case that really it's kind of the whole we think with our whole organism because the information streams in the vagus nerve are largely going up into the brain that there's a way in which the whole body is being used in cognition. Anyway, but let's for the sake of argument take this basic analogy of software and hardware that the physicality of our human organism is the hardware and the consciousness is like a software. The difficulty is that the tendency then is to think in terms of silicon-based hardware, which operates entirely mechanistically. Now we're starting to make some breaks into some other forms of computation, quantum computing, right? This kind of thing. Um, but the but even if you take that analogy and you apply it to understanding the mind body problem, consciousness and the human body, um, our hardware is not silicon based and mechanistic. Our hardware is water based. So if you want to build a computer that can think, that can run the software of human consciousness, well, you have to figure out how to make a computer out that is water, not silicon based. Um, shit, maybe you can do it. But at that point, it sounds so difficult, and the fluid dynamics are so stochastic, right? They're so suffused with randomness, the same way the human organism is suffused with randomness, right? That's why we get cancer. That at that rate, it's like, well, why not just like get in the bedroom and make more humans? Um, like, why try to make artificial water-based computers when we just
sounds
like
like more fun too, right? I mean, hey, well,
I mean, here, here. Um, so, I mean, there's there's some really basic kind of philosophical naivete going on. On the other hand, as little as the computer science people understand about philosophy, I understand about computer science. So one worries a little bit that in these you know in the dialectic back and forth, how much were ships in the night? I don't
Yeah.
know. I'm glad there's really smart people like Taylor who've done the work to really understand the computer science side of it. I don't have the time. I got too many kids. Uh,
You're doing
so
it the water-based way. Yeah.
I'm doing the water-based way. That's right. Water-based intelligence. Yeah, it comes right out.
So, do you, as a teacher, with your students, and as part of a university, how is AI interfacing with human development at
Uh,
the ground level?
yeah, I mean, I apologize for this obscenity with little conviction, but it's just fucking it all up. Um, but that's a cultural problem, not a technology problem.
Yeah.
Right? The cultural problem is this, is that the logic of higher education that's been sold to families is a commercial logic. Um, and so if going and getting a degree is work, is labor, then anything which allows you to exert less energy to get the same reward is rational within the confines of that exchange. It just only makes sense, right? Why would you work harder if you don't have to and you're going to get the same extrinsic payoff? Um, but that's a fun. I mean, to think about education in those terms, Simone Weil's little essay on the right use of school studies is so good on this, right?
Oh yeah, I love it.
Right. That's to think about education the way that a farmhand thinks about changing irrigation. And the bummer is if you do that, what'll happen is that you will become. She says, in the end of the process, you'll become a tradesman with no trade. You'll just come away totally. You'll have engaged it on the wrong basis the entire time. And so it's like the thing you'll hear a lot of times from people is like using AI to do your school assignments is like going to the gym and having a forklift pick up the barbell for you, right? It's like, look how much better it picks up the barbell. It's like, well, sure, but like, what are we doing here? That's an okay. I mean, that's certainly an apt analogy. The one I more often, the angle I'm trying to take with my students is more like you go to a Michelin star restaurant, um, and and they bring you your small plate of deconstructed, beef bolognese or whatever, and you take your spoon and you pick up the beautifully plated little serving, and you open a small stove next to you and you dump it in the stove, and you say it's converting the food into energy much more efficiently. And it's like, I mean, I guess, but like, right, to show up and to not be present to the conscious experience, the delight of encountering this thing that other people
Yeah.
have labored at great expense and difficulty to make for you, that you're spending a lot of time, a lot of money to come and enjoy, to think of it as this kind of burden that's just about energy outputs is like a tragedy, right?
Mm,
So anyway, so really it's like, yeah, the technology, it's not a technology problem. It's a misapprehension of where the problem is to think about it as a technology problem. It's not a technology problem, it's a culture problem.
yeah.
Um, and cultures, technologies can be changed quickly and uh, broadly, and culture changes slowly and on a person to person level usually. But
How much
Thank
of
you.
the I wonder how much of the misplaced exuberance over AI and the problem you were describing amongst students is downstream from the entire knowledge is information paradigm. I
yeah.
mean, it seems if like it it seems to me that it's kind of inevitable that that's if you believe that knowledge is information and that's it, then you're going to find AI exuberance irresistible, and you're going to pursue the wrong things for the wrong reasons
All right,
and
Alan.
your education.
Thanks for popping in, Alan. We'll see you next week. Yeah, and the irony actually is that it keeps us from thinking more clearly about how machine learning could really improve the standard of living for human beings. This is an incredibly powerful, frankly, amazing technology. It's amazing. I mean, the fact that people are enthusiastic about it, I think is well founded. It's incredible. It's really mind-blowing. Um, like I am not technophobic. I am not a Luddite. But I think there's a mythologization of this that comes out of um, cultural problems, also philosophical problems, not understanding what understanding is, not being conscious of our own consciousness, um, that obscures in many ways possibilities for what this technology could do for human living. Um, and that's a bummer that's a bummer just on that level, right? All right, Michael, take care. Uh, the irony is that it actually is detrimental to the integration and the improvement and the utilization of the technology too. Um, anyway, once again on my hobby horse atop my soapbox, um, precariously teetering in the wind. But yeah, that is what I think. All right, y'all. Any last things anybody needs to get off their chest before we bounce out of here?
I was just going to say on the regarding education, John. I was trying to find the quote, but I thought I read somewhere this week that you said something like
Oh,
you half serious about that if you don't if you what did you say about your degree? If it
yeah.
wasn't
So
useless, that you wasted your money.
yes, and
I shared that with a professor friend of mine because I completely agree. I 100% agree.
and I felt that way as an undergraduate. I mean,
Yeah,
I was an undergraduate student, and I resented the instrumentalization of my education
right.
a lot. And that's why I'm the weird. I mean, I tell graduate students when they start teaching, you have to remember that the fact that you're at the front of the room means you're not a representative sample of the rest of the people in the room. And so, I was the weirdo who felt that way, and everyone else was just trying to like make it into the middle class. Um, and probably they were smart, because I've run my share of deficits. So, but anyway, yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, that is. I really do think that if your education isn't useless, you wasted your money. Look at you, perverse people, all nodding in agreement with that. Sickos.
Hey, I went to a great books college, so I definitely fall in that
You're
category.
right there. Very
Amen. All
good.
right.
All right. Well, good. And so we're going to return to Christology next time, and we'll see some of these dynamics at work in how he's treating post-conciliar Christology. And I'll see you next Saturday.
All right, we have 2 weeks left, I think.
I know, home stretch.
Yeah.
Everything you're going to say, you have to narrow it down to the next 2 weeks.
That's right. Got to cook it all in. All right. Take care, y'all.
Thank you,
Thank you.
John.
Thank you.
See ya.